I've been asked to come and talk to you about the boundaries of the Métis Nation. And so I'm going to set out a discussion where we talk about what boundaries are, how you would decide what they would be. I am not trying to tell you, I'm not going to stand here and tell you where the line goes. I'm going to try and give you some principles and ideas on which you can decide where your boundaries are. So having said that, I'm going to start right with the discussion about what boundaries are. And what I mean by boundaries is the social, geographic, and political limits of your nation. And these are what I would say are the result of what I call collective construction and maintenance. So what I mean by construction is that they were created by your ancestors and they've been maintained by your ancestors through lots of different processes, which I'll talk about. So what I want you to get in your minds right off the top is that when I'm talking about a boundary, it's not just a geographical boundary. It's a cultural boundary. It's a social boundary. It contains your stories and your languages and all of those things. There are lots of, it's a layered concept, okay? The next thing is that and the next part I think is probably just a no-brainer for the people in this room. When I talk about a nation and a people, I mean the Métis Nation, and what we're talking about is an Aboriginal people that share common ideas. So you share a common territory, a common history, a common culture, language, and ethnic origin, and aspirations for self-government, and not just aspirations. In the case of the Métis Nation, you have self-government, and you have long been exercising it. So in this situation, I'm using nation as in Métis Nation and people as in Métis people to mean the same thing. But I do not mean them to mean the same thing as like Canada, okay? So I'm distinguishing between our nation state and the Métis Nation. So just so your terms are clear before we start. So really what I'm talking about are two different kinds of boundaries. And the first one is a social boundary, and the second one is a geographic boundary. And you should note that some Aboriginal peoples also have political boundaries. We're going to talk about all those three things. But in this sense, I'm talking about three different distinct concepts: social, geographic, and political. So understanding those, so what's a social boundary? So what I mean by a social boundary is that it's a non-political means of determining who you are. So there's no politics involved in this discussion about the social boundary. It's really the idea that your nation, the idea that you believe you're Métis and that you believe you're a people, really is an idea of our imaginations. And when I say that, I'm not denigrating it. I'm not saying it's not real. I'm saying that it's a non-physical thing. Like, you can't touch it. You can only feel it. You can only think it. It's in our minds and in our hearts, and that's where it is, and it's in your culture. So I want you to understand this is a powerful concept, the idea that you believe, just your belief, based on your culture, that you believe that you're a nation of people. That's a very powerful thing, and it shows you how powerful our imaginations are. And I don't mean that you created it out of imaginary things. I mean that you created it out of real things, but it is something that lives in our minds. So the social boundary really outlines the space that you navigate in, that you live your lives in. And it's filled with all the things that you believe about being Métis. It's filled with your culture, with your language. It's filled with your art. It's filled with your stories. It's filled with your language. It's filled with your customs, with your traditions, with your religion, with your food. With all these things together are what create the social boundary. That, combined with kinship connections, with the family connections, is really what creates your social boundary. And it's the persistence of that That's what I call the maintenance of it. It means you maintain those things by keeping them alive. You maintain them by passing them down to your children. You maintain them by sharing them over and over again and retelling your stories and recooking your food and replaying your music, teaching it, passing it on as it has been passed on to you from your ancestors. That's what maintains this social entity that we call the Métis Nation. And it's what defines the boundary, because if I could put it to you in one sentence, it would go like this. If this is your land, where are your stories, right? You got the stories in your land. You know where they are. But where your stories stop, where your language stops, where your kinship connections stop, that's your social boundary, because what you got on the other side of that is somebody else.